Okay, hello everybody. Hello. So I'm Tina Mansour. I'm the Executive Director at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, and really honored to be a sponsor and supportive of the Montana World Affairs Council and Academic World Quest. We have a lot in common with the World Affairs Council. The Mansfield Center also supports internationalization across Montana, also supports classrooms and students like you. How many of you know, ever heard the name Mike Mansfield before? Raise your hand. Okay, a fair amount. I'm just going to share a little bit about him and how we can support people like you. So we were founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to honor Mike Mansfield. He started out as a juvenile delinquent. He grew up in Great Falls. He ran away from home a number of times. He lied about his age when he was 14 to join the military. Can you imagine being 14? He served in the Army, in the Navy, in the Marines, and then he came back to Montana to Butte, where he worked in the copper mines. He'd never finished his high school diploma. He never thought he would do more than be a miner. But he married a woman, a really strong woman, who completely changed his life and said, come here to the University of Montana. He got his degree. He was a professor of Far Eastern and Latin American Studies, and he went on to be our nation's longest serving Senate Majority Leader and our nation's longest serving U.S. Ambassador to Japan. This from a young boy who grew up with almost nothing and thought that he would never amount to much. So he is our inspiration. Congress supported the Mansfield Center in providing programs of democracy and international engagement to people like you. And what we do now is we have fully funded programs to support high school students and traveling overseas. Is anybody here in our group of Vietnam students or high school student exchange that will travel to Vietnam this summer? Nobody. We have 25 students from Montana that will be traveling to Vietnam, fully funded. We have another 4 students from the Missoula area high schools that will be traveling fully funded to Korea. And later this year, we're going to be recruiting for a sports exchange to Honduras. So we really encourage you and your schools to get involved with the Mansfield Center. We have lots of great opportunities for you. And our goal is to foster globally minded leaders of integrity. And that integrity piece is increasingly critical. When we look at what Mike Mansfield did in terms of ethics, shepherding civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation, acting against war in Vietnam, he's a great role model for us. And so it's exciting for me to be here with you today. I also can say that I was a former diplomat. When I was 22 years old, I joined the Foreign Service, served for 8 years, including 4 years living in Indonesia. So it's such a great opportunity for you to meet people like Ambassador McKinley and the other ambassadors that are here this week. So I really encourage you to learn more about their backgrounds, to talk to them about the Foreign Service, and to consider it as a career. It is a great way to get paid, to learn a language, to travel around the world, and really make a difference in terms of peace, mutual understanding, and broadening your own horizons. So that's enough about the Mansfield Center. Really glad to be here with you. And I know you've all seen Ambassador McKinley's bio. He has an extremely distinguished career. I mean, one of the people that we can really look up to is a consummate diplomat, someone we are so fortunate to have representing the United States. So he served for 37 years. Over the course of his career in the Foreign Service, he held senior leadership positions in Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Afghanistan. He has had extensive experience with regional conflicts and peace negotiations across 3 decades on 3 continents, including Afghanistan, which is what we're honored to have him here today to speak about. So, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
So thank you to Dina, and as a former colleague at the State Department, I'll also mention that we have Ambassador Ted Osius in the audience. So I don't know whether these couple of days are for credit or impact what happens to you at the end of the year, but I think I'm on trial in front of all of my former colleagues here. So I will try to deliver something that's useful and interesting for you. I know you've been reading extensively about Afghanistan, and I did spend 3 years and 4 months straight there, so I have a few things to say. But we're also on a day, and listening to the earlier session, when monumental things are happening in the world. It's Ukraine, but it's not Ukraine. It's a much larger question than what happens in Ukraine, because what we're seeing is a challenge to the entire structure of the world that brought us peace, security, and prosperity over the past 70 years. And I'm sure one of the questions will come up at some point. If not, I'll volunteer it. Whether the withdrawal from Afghanistan last year gave President Putin the sense that the United States was weak and that this would be the right moment to move on the ambitions he had in Ukraine. I don't believe that's the case. I believe the ambition was there for a long time, and that it's related to many other things that are happening in the world. So it's as I speak, and as we look forward to the moment we're living, it might seem like a continuum, but there are so many different aspects of what happens in the world. Sometimes they intersect, sometimes they don't. But I'm also happy, either now or later, because I think we're going to be together on and off over the next couple of days, to speak to anybody who's interested in a foreign service career, and not just a foreign service career, because already in the time I've been here, I've been meeting people who work with NGOs that work internationally overseas. They may be interested in working on climate change issues or helping people who are in dire humanitarian conditions or working on women's rights. There's a host of questions that can be worked on in the international context that don't have to be through government. Or you want to go into business and the importance of the outside world to the prosperity of the United States, which sometimes we begin to forget. And then there is, of course, government service and all of the departments and agencies you can imagine. But always happy to speak about those issues, and always hopeful that a number of you will choose that path. But we're here to talk about Afghanistan, and before I start, I'm going to try to keep my remarks reasonably short to allow for discussion and questions. I'd like to just ask, how many of you had relatives, knew of people who served not just in Afghanistan, but in Iraq over the last 20 years? I'm very glad to see so many hands raised, because what we're looking at is now not just one generation, but verging on 2 generations, in which the United States, since the attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11, 20 years in which the United States was absorbed by wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and the broader Middle East. And they had a profound impact on how the United States looked at the world, related to the world, and also had an impact on how we dealt with, or more accurately, did not deal with, a rising China, a resurgent Russia, changes in the structure of the global economy, changes in expectations populations had, including in the United States, on what to look forward to, the fear factor that worked in, especially after the financial crisis of 2008. Our focus, in many ways, became primarily the global war on terror and all of its ramifications. With the fall of Kabul on August 16th, 2021, it became a good moment for loads of people to try to look back, make their analyses, judgments on whether the sacrifice had been worth it, and whether a historic mistake had been made in leaving Afghanistan the year we did and the way we did, 2 separate things. I'd like to start by suggesting that what's extremely important is to remember what it was like on 9/11. It's in the history books for all of you, but you grew up under its shadow. And what happened on 9/11 required a response. And 9/11 was a reflection of a growing phenomenon of global terrorism and Islamic terrorism, which is increasingly reaching out beyond the areas where it had traditionally operated to strike more widely. And we had the attacks on 9/11. The United States had to respond. Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group that carried out the attack, was in Afghanistan. There was no choice. This was a war that had to happen. And because the Taliban accommodated Al-Qaeda, whether they were involved directly in the planning and execution of 9/11, the Taliban were part of the issue as well. And so we had the attack on Afghanistan, and which fortunately resulted in the Taliban falling quickly, and war with low losses for the United States and the Afghan people at that point. And another decision had to be made in early 2002, and that was whether to stay in Afghanistan and whether to do what is now called nation building. In other words, you go in like we did in Germany and Japan after World War II and help rebuild societies that have been destroyed by war, extremism, pick your subject. And the decision was made that for the United States, for its national security, and given that this form of terrorism was still a threat and spreading, it was important to find a new dispensation in Afghanistan. Help Afghanistan rebuild, help Afghanistan have representative government. And remember, the Taliban was the most extreme government we've seen in modern times. I would say not since World War II, I'd say even beyond that, in terms of how it treated girls and women. There was so much that needed to be addressed inside Afghanistan, and the decision was to help the Afghans who did not support the Taliban, which is the majority of the population, to change things inside their country. And over 20 years, there were profound changes. There's a statistic for you. You're heading off to university. Afghanistan, a country of 30 million people, had 8,000 university students, all male, in the year 2001, ended up with something in the region of 200,000 by 2019, 2020, with over a third of them women. With no girls in school, and a school-age population of several million, by the middle of this past decade, there were 3 million girls in school out of a total of 8 million students in elementary, middle, and high school across the country. In a country where there were no ministries, computers didn't function, the government had services running, hospitals running, not just in the capital, but in major cities and sometimes in rural areas. There'd been development, the build out of everything from water reservoirs to electricity for major cities to rebuilding roads and connectivity. There was a representative government, an elected Congress, Parliament, and the freest press in the region. So what went wrong? At the end of the day, we can point to the need for going into Afghanistan. We can point to the success we had in producing changes inside Afghanistan. But if these changes were so fundamental, so good for Afghanistan. Why did Afghanistan collapse so easily to the Taliban in 2021 with hardly a shot being fired? The answer lies in many things, but I'll start with the United States. In the post 9/11 period, the United States truly became focused on one thing, and that was global war on terror. And the phrase was, you're either with us or against us. The rest of the world didn't quite see it that way. Some of our allies went along with it. But we began to use that definition to drive our engagement, not just in Afghanistan and the rebuilding of Afghanistan, but to remake the Middle East. And so we had the attack on Iraq, and we ended up being drawn into wars, a fight against an even more extreme form of Islamic fundamentalism in the Islamic State that took over in northern Iraq and northern Syria in the 2014-2016 period. The reason I raise this broader issue is early on in Afghanistan, we took our eye off the ball. As we started looking at Iraq and the rest of the Middle East, Afghanistan looked at peace. Taliban was gone, it seemed. And Al-Qaeda, well, we hadn't found Osama bin Laden, but we were looking, and we felt we had enough to continue looking for him. We did. It took 11 years. But we took our eye off the ball. And inside Afghanistan, by 2005, 3 years after we went into the country, the Taliban were already back. By 2008, 2009, they were threatening big cities. We have a tendency to put things in black and white, so we dismiss the Taliban as terrorists and extremists, when in fact the real question should have been, why did they never go away? What kind of support did they really have in the country, or at least certain parts of the country? But the fact is, all of a sudden, we were dealing with a situation which required a much stronger response. And so we had the paradox that in 2011, we found and killed Osama bin Laden. That had been the objective of us going into Afghanistan: eliminate the terrorist threat to the United States. But we now found ourselves in a growing conflict inside the country with the danger that the governments we've been supporting for 10 years would fall. And so we ended up staying. And over the next 9 years, we compounded what we had done. We misread the political situation, political environment inside Afghanistan. We misread how deep the transformation we had promoted inside the country, how deep the roots had gone. We misread the Taliban. We misread the strength of the Afghan security forces we were building up. We underestimated the extent of corruption and the failure of our assistance programs inside the country. And essentially, we presided over what came to be called an eroding stalemate. In other words, year after year, we began to lose just a little more ground as we went along. So as you look at Afghanistan and you look at the decisions that were taken last year, was it the right decision to leave Afghanistan, which is what President Biden announced in April 2021? Was President Trump correct to negotiate the agreement with the Taliban in 2020, which led to the withdrawal of U.S. troops? I believe the answer to that question is yes. But the way in which the withdrawal was carried out was not. Let me take in turn some of the issues I've raised with the way we approached Afghanistan in greater detail. I'll start with the security front. So we essentially operated on the assumption that our assistance to Afghanistan, and particularly when we started working with the police and the military, that we were building a modern, capable security force that would be able to withstand the Taliban, if actually not defeat them. But in fact, the question should be, did we ever succeed? Because as we saw last year, Taliban took over the country effectively in a period of less than 10 days, capturing 34 provincial capitals. That's like capturing the capitals of 34 American states, including the capital, Kabul, in 10 days. What exactly have we built over the previous 10 years? Because even without US tactical support, even without US air support, the Afghan security forces should have been able to withstand the Taliban. They supposedly numbered 330,000 to the Taliban's maximum of 75,000. The Taliban weren't 10 feet tall. They had no airplanes. They had no artillery. They didn't have tanks that they took over. Well, the fact of the matter is, we spent 10 years underestimating how weak the Afghan security forces were. 2012, 2013, we were reporting back to Congress that the Afghan security forces were successfully providing security for their own people, fighting their own battles, and could hold the gains made by a coalition of 50 nations with the best trained and equipped forces in the world. Those words should come back to haunt whoever wrote them. The suggestion that the Afghan security forces were as capable as the NATO forces that were inside Afghanistan at the time, and in succeeding years continued to report that they were building professionally, that they were able to fight, and then only beginning to acknowledge late in the game, well, maybe there weren't 330,000. Maybe there were tens of thousands of ghost soldiers. Maybe Afghan soldiers weren't being paid. Maybe they weren't being led. Maybe there was tremendous corruption inside the military. And most critically, maybe on the battlefield, Taliban weren't just a group of terrorists. They had a base in the southwestern part of Afghanistan where they had popular support and could survive. We may not like that, but it was a fact. And so the Taliban, we sent 100,000 Americans into Afghanistan in 2009 to 2011. Most of the 2,400 Americans who died during that period. We withdrew most of our troops at that time because we were winning. As we started to withdraw in 2012, 2013, the Taliban began to make gains. They made gains every single year from 2013 onwards. It's not something you see talked about or reported on a regular basis. What I'm trying to suggest here is respect the enemy. Something was happening, and the Taliban was becoming more effective, and territory was being lost. And once it became clear the United States really was going to withdraw in 2020, after it reached an agreement with the Taliban to withdraw, it also began to become clear, because I won't say it was clear, that there would be question marks over the ability of the Afghan security forces to carry out the fight. We can go into the details on this, but the fact of the matter is, as 2021 began and the Taliban began to make advances, the Afghan security forces were not effective at defending. And in those last 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, they disappeared. 330,000 people, except there weren't 330,000, even though, as a government, we were still telling the American people there were 330,000 Afghan security forces 3 months before Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. You know, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the general, the person who stands on top of all of our armed services, Well, there was one, and his name was Mike Mullen in the Obama years, and in 2011, he said he opposed extending the large U.S. presence in Afghanistan, quote, because if we did not have significant progress or show significant progress over the course of 18 months, then we have the wrong strategy, and we really need to recalibrate. We never recalibrate. And so you look at the collapse last year, you can question, why didn't we know that the Taliban were advancing? Why didn't we know the Afghan security forces weren't capable of fighting? That's a separate discussion. I'm sympathetic to people who are on the ground. Intelligence is a very difficult question. We're not inside the Taliban. We didn't have people positioned around the country looking at developments. There was no CNN coverage of what the Taliban were doing, as we're seeing right now, in contrast with the situation in Ukraine, where we have reporting coming from every part of that country and that conflict. And the United States also had underestimated whether there's any of you, I understand you've been reading Afghanistan. Part of the folklore is the warlords of Afghanistan, that they had thousands of people, armies that were separate. They didn't materialize, they never appeared, they never fought. So they never existed. How did we miss that for 20 years? We also were dealing with an insurgency in Afghanistan in which the neighboring country, Pakistan, gave them sanctuary. So we pretended to have good relations with Pakistan, or tried to, because we were worried about nuclear weapons in Pakistan. And at the same time had to swallow, as they provided sanctuary and, I believe, support for the Taliban across the years as they killed Americans and as they eventually overthrew everything we had invested in there. You can't defeat an insurgency anywhere if there's a neighboring country that provides sanctuary that will do nothing about that insurgency. The other question is the failure of an Afghan government to emerge that was capable of ruling the country. I'm already 2 minutes over what I would talk, so I'm going to speed through this. But the fact is, we largely imposed a constitution on Afghanistan. We overlooked local realities. You know, sort of a constitutional democracy a la Americana wasn't necessarily what was best for Afghanistan. We tried to decide at times who could be candidates, who were presidents, who were ministers inside the government. I saw this personally. The first president of Afghanistan after 9/11 ended up hating us and working against us, President Karzai, because we tried to remove him in 2009 from the electoral process. But Afghanistan's national political leadership never cohered. A bunch of different ethnic groupings, leaders. There were tensions between regional power brokers in Kabul, between Pashtuns and the minority Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks. Both President Karzai and his successor Ghani managed the government with a spoils system, trying to keep the peace. But in the case of the last president, increasingly depending on Pashtuns to the exclusion of almost everybody else. And so there was not a united government capable of dealing with the Taliban as the Taliban became stronger. And I will concede that the decision by the United States under President Trump to negotiate a separate agreement with the Taliban on the withdrawal of U.S. forces without the Afghan government present did fundamentally hurt and weaken credibility of this government, which was seen as by so many Afghans as our creation. And on nation building, I can talk for the next 10 hours, but the fact of the matter is, for all the things we built, there was tremendous corruption, tremendous waste of $130 billion that went into development assistance, and transitory successes. Our current counter-narcotics program, you're probably aware, Afghanistan, center of poppy production in the world, source of heroin. In just 2020, a year before the fall of Afghanistan, poppy production expanded 37%. And it was expanding when I was there as ambassador. They talked about grandiose projects, Afghans being able to run their own economy, when 75%, 3 out of every 4 cents in the Afghan government spending came from donors. They weren't generated locally. They didn't come from taxes. It was provided from outside. So as you look at what we were supporting and dealing with, and you'll remember I talked about what's happening in the rest of the world. Was it really a smart idea to continue staying in Afghanistan? Spend tens of billions of dollars more every year? For what? To sustain what? One of the geopolitical challenges to the United States were China, or Russia, or climate change, or tensions and divisions in our own society. The fact of the matter is, the decision to leave Afghanistan, like the decision to leave Iraq before it, were predicated on we had either, from one optic, achieved what we wanted, defeating radical Islamic movements, or containing the threat, direct threat to the United States, terrorist groups. But the fact of the matter is, there was another side to it, which was admitting we'd gone as far as we could go. We weren't going to change things, and there was a finite ability of the United States to continue to engage. I'll close this part of my presentation with one observation. When you're in Washington, D.C., you listen to politicians. You listen to people speak about, well, these were peripheral wars for the United States. Over 2 million Americans, 2 million Americans served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Peripheral to whom? Peripheral to people who didn't have children in those wars? We spent almost $3 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A total of over 8,000 Americans were killed. A total of over 50,000 Americans were wounded. $3 trillion. Want to talk about infrastructure spending in our country? Want to talk about maybe all of you going to college? How about money so that college is a lot less costly for people in this country? What about investments in new technologies? Just think about what that money represented. This wasn't a cost-free engagement. It robbed us of policy attention on what was happening in the rest of the world. It robbed us of resources to transform our society. It robbed us of resources to build our educational and health infrastructure to a better place. And it was time to rethink what our real security priorities might be. And I believe that's what we're facing now. On the way the withdrawal was handled, I'm not going to try to justify what happened in any extent. The announcement in April that we were leaving by 9/11, the 20th anniversary, September 11th, was short-sighted, to say the least. The fact that we weren't aware of how quickly the Taliban were moving, the fact that we didn't prepare for departure for all the thousands of people who worked with us. I will defend, because I'm a former government official who's worked in many conflict areas, the bravery and dedication, commitment of everybody who was at that airport trying to help people leave. But at the end of the day, I think we have to look in the mirror and accept that this was not one of our finest moments. But we should not conflate the two issues. Was Afghanistan after 20 years over? Yes, it was. Could we have done a better job of transitioning out? Yes, we could. What are the ramifications going forward? You're going to hear a lot of politicians saying the only reason Putin did what he did was because he saw a weak United States. The United States is a big country. It's the global power. We work in lots of different areas. Putin had spent 20 years thinking about how to reunify the Soviet Empire. You heard that from your previous speakers. And the opportunity and the buildup and the pressures on Ukraine started early in 2020. This wasn't linked to Afghanistan. And he thought he would have a quick victory. By the way, we're only 96 hours into Ukraine. I don't know how people define quick victory, but we don't know what the outcome is. And I think we have to wish the Ukrainian people the best while acknowledging that the worst may yet be to come. So as we look at the global stage and what we're dealing with now, I would avoid mixing the decision on departure with what happened afterwards. And I would suggest that everything that happens in the world, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's rebuilding with Europe, whether it's a favorite area of mine that we neglect all the time, Latin America, Indo-Pacific, there's so much else in the world we have to focus on. And hopefully that's what we're going to be moving on to do. So I am 11 minutes over what I said I would do, but that still leaves plenty of time for questions. And like I say, if you don't want to talk about this, ask any questions you have on your mind. I'll be happy to answer, and I'll try to keep the answers short so that people aren't left standing at the microphone, if people stand at the microphone. Thank you very much.
All right, so I was wondering, based on a lot of research I've done, specifically in Nigeria, I've noticed, and I've researched this specifically, that people ended up joining Boko Haram because it was an alternative, it was the better alternative for them financially, just to have employment, just to feel like they were doing something. Can you speak to what incentivizes people to join the Taliban? Is it similar to that? And how might the living conditions in Afghanistan specifically might encourage people to join that?
That's a huge question, and so this is already a challenge to me to keep my answers short. And I love it because I spent a dozen years of my life working on sub-Saharan Africa, and I worked on conflicts in the Congo. I worked on countries coming out of conflict like Mozambique and Uganda. I worked on conflicts in Ethiopia, Somalia, and I worked on conflicts in West Africa. And also, dealt with movements like not unlike Boko Haram in northern Uganda, northern Congo. There was Lord's Resistance Army, which went around kidnapping children, teaching them to kill, and is spreading terror in different ways. I would distinguish between groups like Lord's Resistance Army and Boko Haram, and groups that have more of an ideological consistency. In other words, they don't arise simply because they're in areas where there's no governance. So in many of these countries where there's been persistent conflict or lack of a government presence, that's a nebulous term. None of us know what it's like to live in a place where there's not a police person, there's not a soldier, there's not a government official, there's not a school, there's not a health clinic, there may be only dirt roads. Groups like Boko Haram, Lord's Resistance Army, rise out of areas that have been basically ungoverned and are in some kind of incipient conflict to begin with. And it combines with banditry. There can be ethnicity issues involved. There can be religious differences involved. But as they evolve, as they act, you eventually see, are they really a movement, or are they some kind of aggrandized banditry? I would suggest Boko Haram fits closer to that than some of the rebellions we're seeing in countries neighboring Nigeria, where you have elements of Islamic State with a very fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, who are doing many of the same things, killing civilians, terrorizing, and so on, but have an internal coherent ideology. And when we're looking at conflict and looking at experiences in different parts of the world, Americans are never, and Europeans are never very good at understanding how extremism exists. I don't try to understand why it exists. History is full of movements, nations, leaders who believe certain things. Afghanistan, without the Taliban, is probably the most conservative Islamic society on earth. So despite the 3 million girls in school, rights for women, the trappings of democracy, there was a percentage of the population that still saw things in more traditional ways. And some of them, particularly in southern Afghanistan and Helmand and Kandahar, saw things the way the Taliban saw them. Even with American opinion poll efforts that gauge support inside Afghanistan for the Taliban, I remember when I was there in 2014 or 2015, a poll said only 8% of Afghans support the Taliban. Let's see, 8% out of 30 million people. That's a couple of million people. And then you add the passive support. And so what we should never underestimate is what people choose to believe, what they believe in. For example, looking at Ukraine right now, if you read half your media articles or watching CNN, is Putin insane? Is he a madman? Well, he may be now. I'm not going to get into the psychology of the issue. What I am going to say is, when for 20 years he talked about the same thing, when we didn't consider him a madman, we never respected the fact that this guy was telling us he didn't believe Ukraine was a nation. I don't know where it comes from. We can debate it and explain it. I'm giving you the parallel because people can believe extreme things. President Putin's believing Ukraine isn't a nation, right? He wrote a 5,000-word article last summer about it, and everybody said, "What's this rambling stuff?" I prefer, particularly if you're in a conflict, try to understand what's in the head of the person on the other side. For whatever reasons, some people in Afghanistan support the Taliban. For whatever reasons, and we still haven't seen a single explanation at senior level. Why did the Afghan military disappear? Why was there no fighting in the country in the last 10 days as city after city after city fell? What kind of deals were being worked out? What did the Taliban already come to agreements with local leadership? The day we understand that, we'll understand why people think they do the way they do. So I'm not going to pretend to understand it, but I'm going to recognize it as a reality and as part of the existence. To come back to your opening point, I don't believe it's exactly comparable to the Boko Harams of this world. Thanks.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, so the United States is the top supplier of arms to Saudi Arabia. But as we can see, they've used these arms to fuel the conflict in Yemen, and then also these arms have gotten into the hands of Al Qaeda. So considering that and your background on the Middle East, should the United States draw back from economic ties and political ties to Saudi Arabia, and how would that look?
So I just had this conversation at lunchtime, so I actually have the answer figured out. And but let me start by acknowledging, I was still in the government when the journalist Adnan Khashoggi was not only killed, but killed in a particularly horrific manner, and where it was clear it was Saudi government. And it's not true the United States did nothing. In 4 to 6 weeks, there were sanctions, serious sanctions of the kind people were pushing for on Putin's inner circle and so on. I think the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman's chief of staff, security chief, all these people were sanctioned. Dozens of people were sanctioned. And there was a very public push by the administration for criminal prosecutions and so on. At the end of the day, I think the administration decided they didn't have the smoking gun. And so going forward, the Crown Prince was not replaced in Saudi Arabia and continued to be the heir apparent to the throne. These are the interests that we have working with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, I'll just take the last couple of years. I'm not going to make the historic arguments. In the last couple of years, Saudi Arabia with the Emirates, with Abu Dhabi and Dubai, was absolutely central to the accommodation with Israel that administrations have been seeking for the last 30 years. Important achievement for American foreign policy, for Israel's security, for changing the dynamic of how things work in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia was a critical factor in funding and support against extremists in Iraq. Saudi Arabia is fundamental in responding to an eventual nuclear threat from Iran. Especially now, the fact that Saudi Arabia is the world's biggest oil producer, or second biggest, we're the biggest. Well, guess where we're turning to look for alternatives to Russian gas and oil as we consider whether to sanction. We're looking at the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. That has tremendous import for how Europe decides to stand firm on Russia. On Yemen, we've managed to at least start, no more, start the process of dialogue towards peace. I'm not sure it's going to get there at all. But the other persons at the table in Yemen are Islamic fundamentalists aligned with Iran. Human rights abuse of the bombings in Yemen are well documented. But there's a broader picture in Yemen as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is I don't envisage a change, but it shouldn't be looked at in terms of black and white again. There's some very real reasons why we have to continue to engage. We don't run Saudi Arabia. We don't change governments. The idea that the United States can shake its finger at any situation and change things is ridiculous. Closer to home, Nicaragua, people in Central America, dictator Ortega locks up all his opposition, has a fake election. This country is completely dependent on the United States. You think we were able to stop anything? That's right next door. We don't run things, so sometimes we have to adapt to things.
Thank you.
Of course, once again, thank you for your time, not only here, but also the time you spent serving as a diplomat. Of course, we can briefly express the gratitude which you have earned. However, with the point that you made, that essentially, of course, the war in Afghanistan was very long, very violent, and dangerous, however, in the end, altogether inefficient. While, of course, that still remains true, I was curious what lessons you feel we could pull from that situation in order to not only be a more effective partner internationally, but also to establish more unity in a currently divided country.
So I'm not touching anything domestic in the United States. So But in terms of what lessons you learn, I've worked on conflicts a lot of my career. Well before anybody's time, I worked on Central America in the 1980s. I worked on different conflicts in Africa, Ethiopia, Angola, Namibia, things that are just in the history books now. And then I worked also as ambassador on Colombia and Afghanistan. So my 2 cents worth on that is recognize that every situation is different and that not every conflict situation is amenable to a resolution. The idea that people want peace, good luck with that if they haven't finished killing each other, or if one side thinks they can still win a military victory. We need to acknowledge that these sorts of psychologies come into how conflicts wage themselves. We also have situations where people who should be working together never do. Libya is another place where there's a lot of conflict. There's literally dozens of political leaders trying to carve out tiny spaces and never reaching agreement on what might be some kind of government that can function in the whole of the country. We can't change that. And then there's situations where you can make a difference, but so much depends on whether the actors in the conflict want that difference to be made. So Colombia, for me, is the most successful U.S. engagement in the last 30 years. Colombia, we remember Pablo Escobar, drug cartels, paramilitaries massacring villagers, left-wing insurgencies that are drug cartels. The place seemed to be falling apart. And we went in with something called Plan Colombia at the end of the 90s. And over a 10-year period, Colombia stabilized. But it stabilized not because of us. We helped stabilize because Colombian people, Colombian political leadership did an about-face and started working on things differently. That was a critical factor in success. In conflicts where I worked on Mozambique, which nobody's going to remember, it was a brutal, brutal war that went on for 15 years and ended up with an agreement between the insurgency and the government. And we reached a soft landing, and it was one of the more successful immediate peacekeeping initiatives after the Cold War. Both sides wanted peace after 15 years. What do you do in a situation like Afghanistan where one side doesn't? And you can't defeat them militarily. And the political leadership inside the country is completely divided, only in it for themselves, and counting on the United States to rescue them. Not such a great hand to work. And so what I'm trying to suggest is you also have to know where to cut your losses. Afghanistan was about Al-Qaeda. It wasn't about building a new nation. But we took on additional responsibilities, so to speak. We need to learn how not to get drawn into every conflict as though it was central to United States interests. And I think that's what's driving in part the decision not to intervene more directly in Ukraine. Although what's also driving that is Russia has nuclear weapons, and we need to tread we have to be conscious of the whole totality of what Russia's potential threat represents. All right, next.
So I believe at the beginning you mentioned the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and how after the collapse, after they left and America withdrew, the Taliban rose to power. Do you believe that if America had engaged in a nation-building attempt before the Taliban had really gotten roots in Afghanistan, it would have prevented the rise of the Taliban? Or do you believe that the Mujahideen, which the Taliban has its roots in, was already too engrossed within the society to have that actually be useful?
That's a wonderful question. And I'd like to answer it emotionally, which is, yes, we should have. And I'll just take a step back and say, when the Soviet-backed government fell and the Russians departed, Russians departed 2 years before the Soviet-backed government fell. In other words, for 2 years, that's a lot longer than the no-day survival rate of the government we were supporting. But their government survived for 2 years. We weren't going to help them then. They were in the Russian camp, right? That was the mentality. Soviet camp, sorry. And then a civil war began among all the people we've been supporting. And it destroyed Afghanistan. So I'm not sure there was a window to engage with Afghanistan with an offer to be more helpful as the country emerged from the Soviet government that had been imposed. I just don't see that there was enough time to engage. Do I think it could have made a difference then? Absolutely. But you also have to have the space. Things happen from one day to the next. There's no easy entry, if you will, into trying to provide a diplomatic solution. Others may dispute and say there was a year or two when we could have done something. It was the end of the Cold War. It was the collapse of the Soviet Union. 15 new countries came into being. And we were busy, the world's a big place, and our attention just shifted elsewhere. And Afghanistan didn't seem at all central to the United States. In terms of how things evolve on conflicts, I spent a lot of my time, as I said, on sub-Saharan Africa. I'm visceral on this. I wasn't on the ground, worked on it from a distance, but the famine in Somalia in the early 90s, where we did nothing as 300,000 people starved to death on the cameras of the world, starved to death. There's, in my experience, I don't think there's anything worse than watching a generalized famine. Now, Somalia wasn't central to the United States. Rwanda and the Tutsi genocide. We did nothing. The world did nothing when 800,000 people were killed in 4 months for no other reason than belonging to a different ethnic group. I can add to the examples. What I'm trying to suggest to you is governments, United States can't solve every conflict in the world, be everywhere at once. And perhaps there was a window then, but there were a lot of other things happening, and Afghanistan slipped from focus.
So this is an interesting question, considering you said that it is, like, I forget the exact word, but intolerable to sit back and watch as thousands of people starve, because a similar situation is happening in Afghanistan now due to factors like the IMF not giving loans and financial aid to Afghanistan. Do you believe that the IMF and other global financial institutions should engage with the new Taliban government despite its authoritarian and backwards tendencies in order to prevent this starvation?
Thank you for giving me a question I can hit out of the park. Since November, I've been speaking out on it. I've written on it with no. I was one of the first people with government or prior government experience to speak out on it. And I've been in organizations, groups, talking, engagements with the administration to argue for much more flexible engagement to provide the cash that humanitarian groups need to operate with in Afghanistan. And I'm gonna be careful because I don't want to be hypercritical. This is one of those moments where you take a tough decision, which people are going to criticize. You're helping the Taliban. You know, give cash to Afghanistan, Taliban's going to get some of it. Therefore, you're helping the Taliban. Okay, some money may end up in their hands. In the meantime, we're watching an absolutely epic disaster building right now. I don't know when it's going to go off the cliff, but it is truly, you know, in slow motion, we're watching something terrible happen, which requires a different kind of response. So I hope we get there.
Thank you.
Just thank you for coming and spending time with us. It's really helpful to World Quest as a whole, and I'm really grateful for it, as I'm sure everyone in this room is. But earlier you mentioned the $3 trillion that we spent for Afghanistan
And Iraq.
and Iraq, thank you, and how it could have been spent here in America. Is there a cap or a certain amount that we are willing to spend to protect Ukraine? And if there is, how can we justify placing a monetary limit on people's lives?
So when I talked about $3 trillion, I talked about it in the context of people saying it was a cost the United States could bear across time. In other words, this wasn't going to bankrupt the US nation, etc. So I tried to put it in a perspective that you don't have to accept unless you don't have to accept it. The perspective context I was trying to place it in is all last year we were debating a trillion here for infrastructure, 250 billion there for tech, innovation, and so on. And we had terrible debates, and our politics are very divided over how much money should be spent. So if you look at it from that context, $3 trillion spent in wars we lost, let me emphasize, we lost, is not a great return on investment, in addition to the immense human suffering that took place. And I tried to lay out, and again, by the way, everybody, you don't have to agree with what I laid out. So it's an alternative point of view, and there's many others out there. I think some of them are in your readings. You know, the beauty of post an event analysis is that it takes place over years. People factor in new perspectives and try to understand what happened. And so I'm offering one perspective on the issue of where you begin to draw lines on people's lives at risk. And again, this is one on which I have to try to be objective, but I'm not really. I've watched too many situations where we've watched lots of people get killed and we do nothing. And I worked on Nicaragua in 2018, 2019. The president there, Daniel Ortega, shot 400 people to death on the streets. This is in Central America for political demonstrations. I just look at how many times we don't engage. And I think I've tried to explain why it's not possible to engage everywhere. Otherwise, we'd be at war everywhere. And we have a few issues to deal with in this country in terms of development, in terms of, you know, pushing ourselves forward. But there are situations which become existential for the security of the United States. Getting Al-Qaeda was existential. Transforming Iraq and Afghanistan is not. As we look at Ukraine right now, and and I'll be polite about this, but we've committed all of $1 billion in 1 year to Ukraine. 1 billion. 350 million of them on Thursday or Friday. And I think it's reasonable to ask how we're going to get the weapons in or the support into a country that's surrounded by the Russians. And we had a speech last week in which it was said that, well, we're going to impose sanctions, but we don't want to hurt the American consumer. Well, I'd ask everybody in this room, worth paying another 10, 20 cents at the gallon so that Ukraine can maybe survive? So I do believe you make the judgment on case by case. So on this one, I am frankly do not understand why we don't do the gas and oil sanctions. Why? Because we're all going to have to pay more at the gas pump. Or maybe some European countries, they may even have to stand in line to fill their gas in their car. Well, if Putin wins in an overwhelming way, the cost to all of us in the next 10 years is going to be a lot more than 10 cents extra on the gallon. So I would suggest there are moments where you make the sacrifices, but you have to make the judgment call case by case.
My question is about Pakistan. You stated that Pakistan harbored these members of the Taliban. However, the Pakistan people were trying to provide a place of refuge to the Afghanistan refugees, correct? So is there anything that we could have done differently to assist the Afghanistan refugees that would have helped to prevent the Taliban being able to gain support in that area?
That's a great question. And so allow me, the longer this goes on, I might actually start talking about personal experiences. I worked a lot on refugee issues, and it's very, very dear to my heart. On Afghanistan, after the overthrow, up to 9/11, single largest displaced persons and refugee populations in the world were Afghans. Something like 7 million of them out of the country, mostly Iran and Pakistan. And we overthrew the Taliban, and millions came back in the succeeding years. And so we provided the support for them. We continue to provide the support through UN agencies to the ones who decided to stay in Pakistan. And so I don't think there's anything more we could have done there. Taliban's not a question of money, it's a question of ideology. And so they're a structure which they rebuilt after they were defeated militarily. They rebuilt in Pakistan. And because Pakistan has its own Taliban, Pakistan there's more Pashtuns. The largest ethnic group in Afghanistan is Pashtun. There are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than in Afghanistan. And so there was no tension, if you will. I mean, there was a tension of having people come in poor areas where you find the resources to take care of them. There was no cultural clash. And so were the Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis were very generous. But within that, when you're talking about millions of people, you're talking about a few thousand in the Taliban. They set up in these towns called Quetta and Peshawar on the border with Afghanistan. And I repeat, this is my opinion because I have to stick to that until absolutely incontrovertible information emerges on it. But I'm absolutely of the mind that Pakistan never did what it needed to against the Afghan Taliban, that they allowed them to operate, that they supported them, they allowed them to cross the border. When we were there, they allowed them to kill Americans. They never, ever cracked down on them. And this was at times when we were giving them $3 billion a year. When Osama bin Laden was found where? In Pakistan. How did Osama bin Laden hide in Pakistan all those years? In a big house near military, in a military residential area. So I have a view of this, that this really was a Pakistani government decision. They didn't trust us in Afghanistan. They worried about Afghanistan instability, and they were keeping their options open because they have their own extremist Taliban inside Pakistan. So they were playing a balancing game. We can explain why Pakistan did what it did. It doesn't explain why we weren't harder on this. We didn't go attacking the Taliban inside Pakistan, for example. So I think we need to separate the two issues. But on refugees, we were very generous. So were the Pakistani people, absolutely. But they're separate questions.
Hello. My question was, and obviously we can't go back and see how history would have changed, but without the tragic events of 9/11, specifically the heavily terrorist attacks, do you believe that America would have gotten as involved in the entire terrorism issue as it currently is?
Not at all. And obviously, 9/11 is a terrible tragedy for everybody who lived through it and the aftermath. But it's also had serious consequences for how the United States did its foreign policy. And, I can go administration by administration, but I don't want to. I don't want to politicize this. But it's fair to say that administrations got wrapped up in, this is what we have to do. And they listed the other things we have to do. These are very intelligent people. They can see what's happening around the world. But there's only 24 hours in the day. What did they choose to prioritize? And so from my perspective, yeah, we did other things. But at the end of the day, what cost us as a nation? And it was the undue focus on the global war on terrorism.
Thank you.
You talked about earlier in your lecture the U.S. government underestimating Taliban. What were some of the key ways that the U.S. government and military underestimated them?
So I'm not a Taliban sympathizer, okay? But there's enough examples of insurgencies that win around the world. And then governments have to deal with them, because that's who ends up on top are the too strong to defeat in the battlefield. So among the people who are obsessed with Afghanistan, I try not to be one of those, but I'm not sure I can escape the same tag. Taliban were overthrown by December of 2001. We go in 2002. There is tons of research that the Taliban, key elements of Taliban leadership reached out and wanted to be included in the political transition inside the country. And we said no. It was a bit of this, a bunch of terrorists, or a bunch of this, that, whatever. If I had been there and looking at the situation, so it's better to deal with warlords who killed tens of thousands of people in bombings and so on during the Civil War. I mean, there's a point at which you're establishing metrics on who you'll deal with and who you won't. We dealt with a lot of very bad people in Afghanistan after 9/11. Terrible people. We didn't exclude them from the political process. And so in those early couple of years, there were the feelers, and it was overwhelming rejection. We don't want the Taliban here. They have no role to play in the future of Afghanistan. That's the end of that. They were never coming back militarily, which is why we started taking out all our troops and got ready for Iraq. the war in Iraq. We shifted our focus. We were going to get rid of Saddam Hussein and move on. It took a bit of time, but by 2005, 2006, the Taliban were evident again as an insurgency inside the country, carrying out little terrorist acts. And then it morphed, and they were carrying out semi-military acts by 2008, 2009. Where were all the analysts then on understanding what was happening in terms of the transformation of the Taliban into a capable fighting organization again? Then we had the surge, and we put 100,000 troops in. And we inflicted heavy losses on the Taliban, and they stopped being able to pressure cities. And then we declared victory. Why did we declare victory? By 2013, as I mentioned earlier, they were back. They were beginning to come back. We didn't win. We defeated them. That's not the same thing as a victory. And so they went away, regrouped, and they were back. You know, their leaders were killed, died. We carried out the heaviest aerial bombardment of Taliban positions in the whole war. We carried that out in, I think, 2017, 2018. Didn't make a difference. Taliban were back and kept making gains. So this underestimation of what Taliban were capable of militarily was constant. On the political front, as I said, there was this rejection of them having political relevance at the beginning. By the 2010s, people were acknowledging that the Taliban had little spheres of influence in different parts of the country, particularly south, in which they all but ran districts like counties. And they ran the law, and they provided basic services. So I don't know what that means, but that's what was said at the time. So they were beginning to show that they were political inside the country as well as capable of military. And President Karzai and then other people in the next government said, we got to talk to them. They're political, they're key actors. And that's when we finally began to accept around 2015 that no military victory in Afghanistan, we needed a negotiated settlement among Afghans. By the end, when we reached our separate agreement with them, I don't know if it was trust or the belief that they would wait until we left to launch their attacks. But I don't think we expected them to launch their full-scale attack before we left. That caught us by surprise. So those are the examples across the chronology.
Okay, so when I was listening to your presentation, I just noticed that, like, it seems very similar what we did in Afghanistan to what we did in Vietnam. And so I guess I wanted to know, why did the government learn from the fact that, like, creating a democracy in one of these less developed countries and having a massive war there for decades didn't work? Like, why did we learn that, you know, why did we go into Afghanistan again after failing in Vietnam?
Well, because it was mission creep. We went in early. It seemed we had won. There was not really any conflict in Afghanistan up to about 2005. You know, people who worked in Afghanistan in those days drove through the country. Up to 2013, 2014, and up to 2013, I arrived in 2013, and there was an attack on a Lebanese restaurant where 13 Westerners were killed. I think it was in February 2014. Up to that point, we were allowed to go out into the city with escorts, go to restaurants, go to people's Afghan contacts' houses, and so on. So it's gradual. So the deterioration, and so you convince yourself you're making a difference. And in the case of Afghanistan, what I've tried to say, we had a functioning Congress, we had ministries developing, we had education coming back, rights for women coming back, education for girls. There was a lot we could look at and think we're making progress. And the Afghans are really going to want this. They're really going to fight for this. This is what they want. And so I don't put the blame, and part of it is you live the moment. You can't, and so I don't want to be overly harsh. What I do believe is when things start to go against you, you need to read it, and we chose not to. We chose not to in a manner that would have led to a change in how we engage inside the country, and I think that's a mistake. But one of the reasons we do nation building is it works in some places. So, I worked Mozambique. It's one of the best moments of my life. It happened. The war stopped. People stopped killing each other. We started killing each other again a couple of years ago, but anyways, that's but it's not related to what that initial conflict was about, and in which 500,000 people died. And it worked in Colombia. I worked on the breakup of Ethiopia and Eritrea into two countries. It was a great feeling because they didn't kill each other to separate as nations. It didn't become a war like Kosovo and the Balkans and so on. So there are moments when things seem to work. And so it's not an exact science. What I'm trying to suggest with Afghanistan is the telltale signs were there at different points to do a rethink. By the way, the rethink was done in effect. President Obama wanted to pull all the troops out in 2014 and then was convinced not to. New York Times in 2016, look at all the criticism there's been of President Biden's decision. New York Times in 2016 did an editorial in which it said Obama should pull all the troops out of Afghanistan in 2016. That year. Not wait. No time frame, no agreement with the Taliban, just pull out. So there were question marks throughout this. President Bush initially wanted out, and then the Taliban went like this, and so everybody's afraid of losing the 9/11 war, right? The killing of Osama bin Laden was a time when we could have probably made the decision.
So earlier you mentioned that the United States withdrew from Afghanistan partially due to the fact that we sort of reached the limit of what we could provide. So do you think there's any possibility of us regaining Afghanistan or helping them again, or do you think it's kind of a lost cause and the Taliban has full control from now on?
I don't think the Taliban is necessarily going to stay in power for a long period. I'm not saying I can predict this. I'm not. They're doing things differently than the first time, so they're not being as extreme. They seem to be trying to survive. I don't know. But do I believe that there's enough? Afghanistan is a country with I love the place, I love the people, but one of the things that just most fascinates me is how so many different ethnicities have largely lived together in peace over the past 100 years. There's been moments like the Civil War in the 90s. These aren't ethnicities that go at each other all the time. And they found a way to accommodate their interests and live together inside the borders of what's called Afghanistan. So what I'm hoping is that maybe there's a chance down the road. Unfortunately, what we're dealing with right now is a terrible situation on the humanitarian front, and the Taliban hasn't made up its mind what has not signaled clearly, that's a better way to put it, where it's going. So I don't know where it's going to end up. Your broader point, if I can leave all of you with one thought, there's a tendency in the United States, going back to the end of World War II, your great-grandparents, your grandparents on forward, that the United States is divided, so the world's divided between the free and the West and the rest of them. Now the world's a lot more complicated than that, and it's gotten a lot more complicated over the last 20 years. And so there's countries we don't have much in common with, who may turn out to be good allies on certain issues, not on others. I think we need to break the mindset of thinking of the world as with us or against us on a given issue. or subject. That's not how things work. We have certain alliances which are well defined, and then there's another 140 countries. And so Afghanistan was never ours. Nicaragua was never ours. Venezuela was never ours. These are countries where things happen, sometimes because of what people want, sometimes because bad actors inside those countries decide certain things. But it's not through the prism of for or against the United States. We need to sort of look at these crises as products of their own environment, not what the United States does. Now, there's plenty of people who say, well, the United States caused this, the United States caused that. I don't see us as the source of all evil. I'm sorry, I'm perhaps too old, but I think we saved the world after 1945. I think we saved the world again after 1989. We're not perfect. We've made mistakes. And now some of those mistakes are coming back to cost us, coming back to cost others too. Okay.
So I feel like after 9/11, the United States kind of reclaimed the overall almost like global peacekeeper. And I'm wondering, do you think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is kind of representing the U.S. again moving away from that, like it did up until 9/11? Or do you think it's more of like an isolated incident and the United States is going to continue kind of trying to carry out its ideals and enforce its values in the world stage?
So, from my earlier response, you'll see I don't believe we should be forcing certain things around the world, and we're not going to succeed. Where we do play a role is we're the single most powerful country in the world, the largest economy in the world, and we're the only country that can project militarily on a global scale. So the fact that, and by the way, we have deliberately avoided being drawn into formal peacekeeping. We don't contribute troops to UN peacekeeping operations. So, for example, Haiti, you may not remember, but in 2010 there was an earthquake in Haiti that killed 200,000 people. Anyways, UN troops, peacekeepers went in and stayed there for almost 10 years. We look at the war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, peacekeepers have been there for almost 15 plus, 17 plus years. We're not part of those. We support international peacekeeping, but we don't want our troops doing peacekeeping. What we do is respond to conflict. And Afghanistan is a loss. It's a very sad loss for all of the reasons we know. But since Afghanistan fell, we've already been reinforcing our presence in East Asia, working in Indo-Pacific, working with Japan, South Korea, and obviously the threat there is China. And in Europe, for better or worse, we're leading the charge on what I hope will be the revitalization of NATO and our security ties with Europe in response to what's happening on Ukraine. And so I think we still have a very formidable, important role to play in that regard, as long as we keep a limit on it, as long as we don't tip over into more hot wars that we can't win.
So, building off of that statement, do you believe that the United States and its foreign policy is too reliant on military force, that we are too quick to say, oh, Libya, Gaddafi, harming civilians, sending troops, support rebels over the government? And if that is the case, what should we do with, like, say, our Lord's military budget, and what should we do diplomatically to engage conflicts around the world?
Okay, I'm not going to give you the answer you expect, or maybe you will. I'm actually in favor of growing our military budget. I'm in favor of growing our personnel in the armed forces because the situation in the world is so unpredictable and unstable, and we need to modernize what we do. But your other question on whether our foreign policy is too militarized, the answer is a simple yes. And so once we're drawn into a conflict, who do you think comes out on top, State Department or Defense? And it's natural because soldiers are deployed, Americans are getting killed, tough decisions need to be taken. But the sacrifice is of the time and prioritization of diplomacy and other ways of addressing our national interests in a given situation. So what I would like to see is, for example, as we look at the current Ukraine situation, I learn a lot watching all the commentators on the networks speak about conflict, kinds of weapons involved, potential movements by each side. They could also spend a fair amount of time. Switch over from CNN and listen to BBC. Covering the same thing. What do they cover? Sanctions. What do they cover? Diplomatic talks. What do they cover? President Macron talking to Putin. In other words, they're focusing on the other aspect of engagement, which is diplomacy and speaking and conflict resolution. And so I'm hoping we can find a balance here. We do have an issue with this, and I believe it's a direct product of the last 20 years. We went through this on Vietnam, and we somehow grew out of it. We're back in it. And so I don't question for a minute the dedication, commitment to arrive at the right place of all our commanders on the battlefield. I'm just suggesting we need to add this other element. And I'm giving you a very simple example, which may be misleading, but truly, I watch BBC and CNN to get the whole picture, because if I only watch CNN, 80% of the coverage seems to be military. When so much of what's going to happen, if it's going to happen, it's going to have to be, are the sanctions going to work? Are Europeans going to be unified? What are other countries doing? What's Turkey doing on the Black Sea and so on? And so I do think we need to sort of slightly moderate the perspective. Good question.
All right, so we're doing one more question today for
There's two people. I'll answer quickly.
Okay, speak about this.
Okay. What do you think would have been the impact if the U.S. had chosen to engage with the Afghan government in like the final treaties? Like, could that have slowed Taliban overall with like the Afghan government being recognized? And just your thoughts on that.
So I really struggle with that one because my opinion's been changing. Ideally, the negotiations should have included the Afghan government on the withdrawal agreement. Did not. And I think what is beginning to become clearer is that President Trump was going to pull the troops out from one day to the next if he didn't have an agreement. So what was important was reaching an agreement. What didn't happen is after the agreement was reached, the Taliban began violating parts of it. There were plenty of opportunities to say no, and they weren't taken. And so do I believe there were moments when we could have at least put a break on the calendar of withdrawal to figure out whether the situation on the ground was going to hold? Yeah, I do think they were there, and we missed them. But I'm not going to be categorical on this because I wasn't part of the talks, and the Afghan government, as we can now see in retrospect, wasn't holding together anyways. Okay.
Thank you.
So earlier you touched on the numbers of women being educated in Afghanistan. I'm just curious, essentially, as we were pulling out, the Taliban announced that they would try to give women more rights and grant them more rights. Do they plan on upholding education for women, and have they upheld it?
So I'm in the negative camp. I don't believe anything the Taliban says until they actually act on it. They haven't acted on it. What they haven't done is outright open persecution on the scale they did when they were first in power in the late 90s. And they've committed in March to open schools for girls and to allow women to go to university. But at the same time, they've been throwing women out of jobs in the civil service and the ministries on the argument that they're not safe there, that the divisions between men and women haven't been set up. Are they going to reverse that, or are they using that as an excuse to push women back to being locked in their homes? I think there's a lot still that's unclear. And so some people are trying to be encouraged by what they see. Because the Taliban also grew up for 20 years in Pakistan, where girls and women are educated and women are in the workplace. So it's not as though they didn't see how other Islamic societies run themselves. But the extent to which they change, we're still waiting to see. I think the jury's out.
I see. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's been great. The questions have been fabulous. And I'm wishing you all the best, because I'm hoping, even if the vast majority of you don't go into foreign affairs, foreign policy, touches every aspect of our lives, even indirectly. And so being conscious of it, being interested in it is just a real plus. And it's a real joy to be with you. Thanks.